speaker, Peter Cook, is the Security Director and founder of the Security Association for the Maritime Industry, SAMI, and he's going to talk about accreditation of armed guards. He was an officer in the Royal Marines for 24 years and spent a significant part of his career involved in aspects of maritime security, from counter-terrorism to formulating counter-piracy policy and procedures. When he left the Royal Marines, he managed the London office of a hedge fund, which set up the first hedge fund in Dubai, and he then moved into the security sector, and after a short period into maritime security. He's the founder of SAMI, and he's written a number of articles and appeared on TV commenting on maritime security issues, and he's lectured on maritime security at Greenwich University. Peter.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for Seatrade, or to Seatrade, for inviting me along to speak this afternoon. And indeed, their initiative of setting up the Maritime Security Pavilion, which we have outside, where there are a number of companies that are members of SAMI, and you can discuss with each of them about various aspects of maritime security, which of course is not purely about piracy, but that is the focal point of my brief today. But I will be finishing off by looking ahead at the future. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about the growth of the private maritime security industry really over the last 4 years. Concerns about the quality of those guards and companies, and the development of the regulatory framework for private maritime security companies. And then finally, I'm going to look ahead. Third time you've seen this photograph of a fisherman. You can quite easily tell that he's a fisherman because from the starboard bow of his skiff, he has a fishing net. So he's not a pirate, he's a fisherman. But we won't dwell on that, and I'm not going to dwell on these because these have been covered. However, as we heard earlier on, the Oceans Beyond Piracy report did identify that a significant amount of money had been spent. Now, I don't think you can see it. Over $2.5 billion was borne by the industry in order to be able to maintain maximum speed going through the HRA. It is also interesting that when the industry was saying to the governments of the world, we're paying our taxes, we want the navies to protect us, it was turned straight on its head, and so they were told, do something about it yourselves. Well, that's exactly what happened. There was a concern, though, a significant concern, that using armed guards could lead to a number of problems. Now, this is the Blackwater incident which happened in Iraq, which rings in everybody's ears, especially those in the security community. And last year in May, when I was in the IMO, where we were really beginning to discuss how regulatory structures were going to be put in place, it was not uncommon to hear this phrase used, that private maritime security were wild-eyed, ponytailed, gun-toting mercenaries. That was used by one flag state on a number of occasions. But the size of the area is significant. You can fit the whole of Europe into the high-risk area. The Navy have limited resources, and a number of admirals and senior officers within the navies have said it's like trying to patrol the whole of Europe with 16 police cars or 12 police cars, however many they have on that particular day, that are limited to 16 miles per hour. Not particularly effective. Having said that, as we have heard today, and I echo, the navies at a tactical level and an operational level, and indeed in some ways strategic level, have done a hell of a lot to restrict the ability of the pirates to have sufficient room for maneuver. They have got extended rules of engagement that have allowed them to take the fight to the pirates. And indeed, the way in which the navies have cooperated with each other has also been unprecedented. And it is no mistake here that I'm using a Russian ship as my example. Who would have thought 5 years ago, 6 years ago, that we would see Russians, Indians, Iranians, Japanese, Chinese ships, along with the normal suspects of the NATO and the EU NAVFOR ships, working closely together? It has been a wonderful display of integration and cooperation. Best management practice 4. The industry decided that that's what they needed, they wrote it, and it is effective. And over the last year, we have seen far greater take-up of this, and it is designed to make the ship much harder to actually attack. And in itself, it provides a deterrent, or the ability to defend the ship provides a deterrent. But also in BMP4, they do talk about the use of privately contracted armed security personnel as part of the defensive measure or the deterrence measure for protecting ships. But this was actually the way that people went. It is interesting that of the companies that had a ship taken during 2010, the first thing they did was they said, right, that's it, we're going to go for armed security. And that is really why we had such a significant growth of armed security, because the demand was very high. At the same time, we established SAMI. Now, I started to look around the maritime security industry at 2008 when I came into it, and I identified that there were two key problems. The first one was that the client, whether he be a ship owner, charterer, ship manager, the flag state, or indeed the insurance underwriter, was unable to discern good company from bad. There was no way of measuring. Secondly, that the good, well-established companies were having to compete with what I call coffee shop cowboys. The guys who are sitting in a coffee shop somewhere, I do have to be careful here because we've got a member of Lloyd's, and of course that's where Lloyd's started, but that they were in there and they were having to compete with these guys. And so the idea was that we would formulate a list of reputable private maritime security companies, and then the guys that were on that list would form a guild, and they would then be able to push the standards up. Well, that was the basic concept, and we talked to a number of different parties around. Now, timing is everything with these things, as we learnt very easily. And at the end of December, or the final quarter of 2010, we started to talk to some of the private maritime security companies to see if they thought that this was a good idea. And by and large, they did. They could see it had future. And with the increased number of piracy events, and indeed the rising level of violence, it became more important. And people started to ring us back and say, this is what you need to do. And so on the 11th of April last year, my partner and I, Stephen Jones, decided to launch SAMI. Now, we knew that there were approximately, at that time, 160 companies, and our best estimate was that we would get somewhere between 35 and 50 companies joining us. We currently have 178 private maritime security companies on our books, and approximately 48% of them are UK-based. And right now, there is some variation depending upon the weather, but each month there is something around 1,200 to 1,500 armed transits crossing the Indian Ocean per month. The commander of EU NAVFOR last year made this comment: armed guards have a 100% success rate. I don't have a glitzy video, but I do have that quote. And that has continued. However, as I said earlier on, there was significant concerns about the standard, the quality. Would there be a Blackwater at sea? Which everybody inside the maritime security industry is very hopeful there never is. And indeed, I think the reason why we got so many private maritime security companies joining SAMI was that they wanted to have some form of regulation, because that was always our aim, so that we could segregate the good companies from the bad. Now, as a result of what happened after Gulf War II in 2003, the international community pulled together. And the first document that they pushed out was the Montreux document, which came out in September of 2008. This document was designed to give guidance to nation states on the use of private military and private security companies. In November of 2010, the child of the Montreux document was the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Service Providers, rather unfortunately known as ICOC. But the problem with these two documents was that, number one, they are designed to be used in times of armed conflict, which piracy off the coast of East Africa is not. And secondly, they were both designed to be used on land, which clearly piracy never does. So they weren't fit for purpose. Additionally, it is the IMO, which I'm sure everybody here understands, a United Nations agency that is responsible for formulating the regulation and guidelines for regulatory structures at sea. And so the Maritime Safety Committee in May of last year drew up two documents, MSC Circular 1405 and 1406. 1405 is the guidance to ship owners, operators and managers. 1406 is the guidance to flag states. Additionally, there was work by the UN Contact Group for Piracy off the coast of Somalia. We were working on various elements, and there's a British-based organisation called SCEG, which stands for the Security and Complex Environments Group, who were also working with us and alongside us to formulate guidance and rules. Additionally, there was commercial vetting from a number of different companies, including various underwriters, who obviously wanted to, for themselves, decide upon who was good and who was not so good. And then May of this year, we got MSC 1443. Now, this is the guidance to the private maritime security companies on how they should conduct themselves. And this was entrusted to the ISO, or to the International Organization for Standards, so that they could draw up ISO 28007. Now, ISO 28007 is being discussed and looked at the IMO this week. And I discovered last night that indeed it has been accepted by the IMO, and that will formally be announced later on in the week or early next week. So that's where we are going. There have been other complementary documents. The GuardCon, which is the base contract that is provided by BIMCO, the Baltic International Maritime Council, which is a shipping association that represents 65% of the world's tonnage. And that is the basic contract that is being used by a lot of companies, but not by all. And also various other insurance documents that we've been working on to ensure that the private maritime security companies are insured correctly and comprehensively. So as a look ahead, we have the introduction of ISO PAS. PAS stands for Publicly Available Specification. I can go into details about that, but I'll save that for later. Into a dynamic situation. Whilst I've been part of the core team that's been drawing up the ISO, it is not necessarily going to happen instantly or overnight. It will take time for this new standard to be adopted and be utilized by everybody. There is also standardized rules for the use of force that is being debated between the shipping industry and indeed a significant proportion of the maritime security industry. But the next thing that we have, obviously, is West Africa and beyond. Now, you've already seen this slide earlier on in the presentation. We're having quite a bit of repetition here. But the point that I want to make here is you see the scale of piracy as it is happening across the world. Of the total attacks globally, 261, only 71 of them happened off the East Coast. That is significant. Only half the hijacks happened off the East Coast. This is global, and it is going to continue. Now, I don't know if you can read all of that, but I'm very quickly going to run through it before I finish. Maritime security is a new growth industry. Over the next 20 years, the International Chamber of Shipping have told us that the volume of trade moving by sea is predicted to increase by 50%. That's 50. Over that same period of time, the Western navies are going to shrink by 30%. You don't have to be a mathematician to work out the capability gap there. The cruise liner fleet between 2006 and 2010 increased its capacity to carry passengers by 50%. Today, there are more than 520,000 people on cruise liners at sea. That's more people than there are in the air at any one time. There are more than 4,500 super yachts around the world. A super yacht is a vessel more than 33 meters in length designed specifically for pleasure. 200 of those are helicopter capable. As an indication of that trade, all of the prestige yards are at capacity. And the second-hand market, if you'll excuse the pun, is buoyant. The global thirst for oil and gas is unquenchable. And many of the reserves lie offshore. When you reflect that of the 52 undeveloped nations around the world, 67% of them have a coastline, and there's a lot of overlap, which results in offshore oil and gas being extracted from places that are, number one, more technically challenging, and number two, are less predictable, thereby less safe. And last but by no means least, there are over 8,000 ports around the world, and that is a growing number, and indeed we've heard over the past couple of days how many new port projects there are going on. Population passed 7 billion last year, on its way to 9. And it's obviously far easier to get hold of a cargo before it goes on the ship or after it comes off. That is maritime security, that's the footprint, that's the one that was given to us by the IMO. Therefore, in summary, the exponential growth of the private maritime security industry has been in response to demand by the commercial shipping industry. I've outlined the evolution of the regulatory structure for PMSCs, and it is important to state here that because I think, or because many people think, that this is a growth industry and that maritime security is the way for the future, that these should be looked upon as foundation documents for the future, a stepping stone that will push us in the right direction. But maritime security is a growing global problem. Thank you very much.